Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our Capture One live stream today, which is all about mastering the color editor, whether that be basic, advanced, or working with skin tones. I'm going to be joined by a guest. Oh, hang on. I just need to turn off my monitor or you're going to hear me twice. I'm going to be joined by a guest soon, which is our ambassador, Paul Reiffer. So we're going to find him shortly. Before we get to that, welcome to those of you who have joined us on YouTube or Facebook. All these live streams are always about interactivity, so please don't be afraid to ask questions. If you're hanging out in our live streaming room, you can also ask a question, which again you're very encouraged to do, and you can do that via the Q&A tab. You're welcome to use the chat as well, of course, but if you put the questions into the Q&A tab, then it just helps to separate them out. So Alex, who's also joined us online as well, you might see her answering a few questions too. So specific questions to me, Paul or Alex, pop them in the Q&A, but of course you can use the chat too to talk amongst yourselves. If you want to hide the chat, you can do so. Just click on the down arrow there, and that will give you a bit more space to see Capture One. All right, let's get started and go ahead and find Paul. Hey Paul, how's it going?
Yeah. Hello.
You're here, you're there, good. I saw you spoke up on YouTube as well, so impressive multitasking.
I have two hands.
Yeah, I just hope so. Right, for those people who don't know who you are, because we have quite a lot of people joining this live stream today, and I feel some of them might not have joined one before, so this is probably a new experience. So if you just give the 10-second rundown on who you are and what you do.
So my name is Paul Reiffer, which David's obviously said, but everyone starts with that. So I am a landscape, commercial and cityscape photographer. So we produce the images that travel companies and so on use to promote where they want you to go, basically, and everything in between. So I've been using Capture One for a long time. I shoot with a mix of phase one medium format systems as well as other cameras, and obviously Capture One is part of that workflow. And in the background, I'm one of Capture One's ambassadors, so that means that I effectively am tasked with breaking stuff.
Absolutely. That's one of your images lurking behind us as well, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this location at the end of the live stream and what we're going to be doing. But today is about the color editor, and that's really the only tool that we are focused on, with perhaps a nod to working with layers as well, as the two go hand in hand. We're going to kind of take it in turns to show different stuff. But the goal is today is to break up the color editor into its basic, advanced and skin tone components, and show you some practical examples on that aspect of the tool. So with enough chit chat from me, let's hope I press the right button and bring up my screen. I did successfully. So what we do first of all is look at this guy, the basic tab of the color editor. And Paul, you're welcome to heckle and chip in at any point if you wish, hurl abuse and so on. But I'm going to begin with just giving a simple how-to of how this basic color editor works. Now, because it's called basic doesn't mean that it's bad or that you shouldn't use it or whatever. It just simply is set up preset color ranges and values for you to use, but with little interaction on your part and adjusting those color ranges, and that will make a bit more sense when you see the difference with the advanced color editor as well. So when would I use the basic color editor? So if I wanted to do a really simple task like this guy's shirt here, I feel that's maybe a little bit too oversaturated, a bit too dominant, I can do one or two things. I can pick the color that I want to edit if I'm not entirely sure what the color is, and we've got a couple of good examples where, or Paul has a good example, where you think, oh, I know that's purple, green, pink, blue, or whatever, but it might not actually be. So it's always a safe bet to grab the picker and then click on the color that you wish to edit, and then you see Capture One will pick the correct color swatch, or the one that contains that dominant color, I guess is the best way of saying it. So if I want to, I can then pull down the lightness, of course, change saturation, boost lightness, and then push the hue to change the color slightly. And the easiest way to understand how this is working is, well, first of all, the slider bar tells you how it's going to affect the pick color. but also you can imagine if you're pushing the slider in this direction, you're going to be adjusting the color closer to its neighbor on the left, or if you push it to the right, you're pushing that color closest to its neighbor on the right. So you can also do something called color clustering, where you're trying to maybe take one or two colors and normalize them up, but there's a better way to do that, which we're going to look at with the skin tone tool as well. Okay, so that's a really super basic example. If I grab something else and grab my picker, that will obviously grab the greens, and then we can play around with the lightness like so. So it's really, extremely simple. What I said at the start, of course, is that this has preset color ranges. So if we look at this button here and click that, that will show you exactly which color range we are affecting. And you said something interesting yesterday, Paul, about people often assume that they're equal, which they are not.
Yeah.
So,
well, people assume A, they're equal, and B, they're fixed.
yes.
Which we'll sort of touch on. But in essence, those colors have been designed by Capture One to be the likely color clusters that sit together. That doesn't necessarily mean that in your particular case, on your particular image, it's going to be perfectly right.
No.
But those, if ever you want a cheat sheet of what they mean by green, for example, green actually spans a huge section of that chart, whereas what they mean by orange is very, very narrow.
Exactly.
And that chart's a bit of a cheat sheet for you.
Yeah, exactly. Now you can adjust these ranges, but to be honest, if you're starting to do that, you may as well use the advanced color editor. You can actually see what elements of the image are being affected by this view selected color range. So everything that dips to monochrome is part of this color range selection. Now, interestingly, I hadn't spotted it on this shot, but you can see in the selected swatch, it actually misses a little bit as well. And also in this example, if we pick our red poncho man, so if I click on the poncho here, rather obviously it's going to pick this patch, and then if I look at the color range here, you can see it's actually missed this part. So this poncho, if you like, or anorak, needs to be adjusted with a couple of different color ranges. Now there is a more sophisticated way to do that in the basic color editor, which is by using something called the direct color editor, because that can actually pick them more than one patch at the same time. So if I long press with my mouse or pen or whatever I'm using, then you see a little four-way arrow go up, and then now if I drag up and down with my cursor, you'll actually see Capture One has picked those two patches. So it's then working in combination. So the direct color editor is kind of a speedy way. Long press, click and hold. If I drag down, I can change saturation. Left and right, I can change the hue. If I hold down my option key, then I can change lightness as well. So that's kind of a nice rapid way to edit the colors, and to be honest, is a better way to use the basic color editor for the fact that it can combine more than one patch at the same time. But you're
There's also something nice with that, in that you're looking at the picture when you're doing it.
Yes, and you're not looking at this.
Set,
yeah, definitely, because now I'm focused on looking at the image as opposed to dragging sliders. However, you're still at the mercy that you have, even if we're combining a couple of ranges, we're still at the mercy of those fixed ranges. So, what was our next bit, Paul?
We've covered what happens when you don't get the right area, as in you wanted it in your range. But there's a byproduct to the basic color editor as well, which is what happens if it's something that you didn't want in your range, and didn't realize. So if we switch across.
Yep, let's pull you up. So it should be this button. Hurrah.
So, icebergs. Icebergs are blue, obviously. Skies are pink, obviously. And snow is white. Yes. Those are the facts of the Earth. And we kind of abide by them most of the time. However, David's just covered the idea that you could select a color in the basic color editor tool, make changes, but it's not going to grab enough of what you see as the same object. Because remember, the color editor tool doesn't know what an object is. It just knows shades and colors. That's all it's relying on. So the reverse is also true, which is I can be affecting something that I don't realize, unfortunately, by accident in that same tool. So let's take our snow, for example, and let's just zoom in up here. So nice big white glacier. on that color editor tool, if I choose this bit of snow, it's purple. This bit of snow is blue. This bit of snow is red. This bit of snow is orange. Now, that in itself, obviously they're quite close to white, but as far as the color editor is concerned, it's included in that slice. So if I were to go somewhere else on this image and start adjusting, for example, the blues down here, I am going to be affecting the blue elements that are in the what is white snow up above. So we need to think about more selective ways of using the color editor where it's not just global, because quite often you don't want everything that's blue to be changed or everything that's yellow to be changed. And then if we switch across to here, there's another thing just to bear in mind, and David's going to cover, well, he's going to do the hard work in a minute on covering how we fix that. But let's look at this example. So very, very simple. This is a load of horseshoes and a blue bucket. The reason that we know it's a blue bucket is because there's blue stuff up here and over there. So the simple thing for me to do is click on our blue over here. We could do it with quick, but let's just pull down the saturation, pull down some lightness, and the blue's gone away. Okay. But what's also changed, if I just undo this temporarily, is the reflection on stuff. So yes, I've fixed my problem, but I've also introduced some change elsewhere that I wouldn't necessarily have noticed if I was only focusing on the bits that I want to alter. So the color editor, especially at a basic level, is great for global changes, great for uniform changes, but it on its own has some risks. You might not pick the whole of the area that you want or the object you want because it's not included in the basic range. You might choose an area that you don't want to affect by accident because you didn't realize it was in that slice.
Especially if you're not looking at it as well.
Exactly, yeah. If you're not looking at the screen, you wouldn't notice. And like in this case here, you might accidentally make some changes that alter how the rest of the image feels because you're doing global changes. And David's going to fix that.
Yes, I am, hopefully. Which leads us nicely into me pressing the wrong button. There we go.
That's just a big me now.
That was just... So let me go and grab a different set of images. So we've got some, well, you could think tasty or you could think not tasty, but that's up to you. But there's actually quite a spectrum of colors in these guys here. And of course, using the basic color editor, there's a high chance that I'm not going to grab all of them, and it's not necessarily super easy to make, you know, an informed choice about what you're going to include and what you're not going to include. So for those of us who've been using Capture One for a long time, our tendency is that we often gravitate to the Advanced tab without looking at the Basic tab. Primarily because at a point in time the Basic tab was actually pretty useless before it had this upgrade, if I may say so myself. So it really didn't have much benefit at all. So we tended to gravitate to the Advanced tab rather than getting frustrated with Basic. But with the Advanced tab, then the onus is on you to set the color range, and you've got one actual important additional dimension, which is saturation range as well as color range. So let's say we want to edit these guys here. So if I grab my color picker and then click on the color I want to edit, then straight away Capture One gives you a suggested color range. So the dot is the exact color that I selected. The range, or this solid white line, is the range of color that's going to be adjusted. And this fuzzy white line on the outside relates to the first slider, which is called smoothness. So this controls the roll off of color into its nearest neighbors. So if that's a really hard cutoff, it can lead to something like posterization, where you're adjusting a color and then you're falling off a cliff to no editing and you don't have a nice smooth roll off. So what actually is that color range? Now that's very hard to determine without turning this on, which is view selected color range. So as soon as I turn that on, everything goes to monochrome, which is not part of my selection. And just with that simple pick, we've actually missed, you know, some of the ranges around here. So if I start to widen the net, as it were, you can see as I sneak from the, I guess, orange reds towards the yellow, this area now comes to life, whereas before on the default pick it was missing. If we sneak a little bit this way, yeah, you can see if I go close to the color pick and away, then we're actually excluding whatever the technical term for these are. on a king prawn, we're actually cutting those off. Now this dimension, as I mentioned earlier, is our saturation range. So that's really powerful, because if you're making a selection and you only want to affect, the subtle saturation levels of that particular color pick, or the greater ones, then you've actually got that choice. So I can include the entire saturation range, I can cut out the lower saturation parts, the higher saturation parts, and so on. So it's very responsive, so it's easy to make that selection. However,
I was going to say, David, in terms of, so if people don't, if you're trying to think through a scenario where that's applicable, so if you think about trying to get colors, in this case, in those shrimp / prawn / whatever, there are bits on that picture which are already very saturated red. So if I choose the area of red and then push the saturation up to get the other bits to boost, I'm going to push the bits that are already saturated way too far.
Yeah, too much.
So the advanced tool gives you the ability to restrict the area that you're actually affecting to only the bits that you want to increase saturation or decrease.
Yeah, exactly. So if this guy had really super red saturated whatevers, then I might decide, okay, well, I'm going to not affect those. So when I do bring up my saturation, I'm not blasting out, as you say, the saturation in those areas. And a word of warning in the color editor, this saturation slider has no protection, if you like. So if you push it to a stupid number, it will keep saturating. Whereas in the, where are we? Exposure, sorry, not exposure tool.
Yes, exposure.
Exposure tool. Yeah, bottom, saturation. Here we go. So this actually has a limiter.
It's got bumpers.
Yeah. So I guess if we look at this plant flower over here, if I push the saturation up, doesn't actually dramatically change a huge amount. It gets more saturated, but it won't fall off the cliff like it would if I selected it here and pushed the saturation up. Then it's, completely out of range. So that's just a good word of warning when using.
A little goes a long way.
Yeah, definitely. So with great power comes responsibility, of course, and advanced is advanced. So yes, there's not those bumpers on there which protect you in a more simple tool like the saturation slider in the exposure tool. So if I turn on view selected color range once more, let's make sure we've got all of that crustacean like so. However, no matter what I do here, and I can try to think, okay, well, should I come closer to the pick color? Should I make the smoothness cut off much sooner to try to limit the spread into neighboring colors? But no matter what I do, I cannot avoid some elements like the lemon here, the flowers, and so on. So rather than stressing myself about playing with the ranges, the easiest way to do it is to do a super rough layer. So like the horseshoe example, if we didn't want elements of that to be affected, then we could just do either an exclusion mask or an inclusion mask. So I guess I would refer to this as an inclusion mask, because I want, if I bump up my flow and have it relatively hard, I want to include all of these guys. So if I press M on the keyboard, I can see the mask. So I'm just going to do a pretty rough mask. If I had a bit more time, I would just make sure I was relatively neat around the edges of the lemon. But concept wise, super rough mask like that. M to hide the mask.
That's shocking. use magic brush.
I could use magic brush. I could do. We'll try that in a second. But now, of course, if I whack up the saturation, you see it's only affecting those guys. It's not actually affecting anything else. Now we're not going to do that, of course, but I might want to do that, like so. So yeah, you don't have to be, Paul, especially particular with the mask, but if you wanted to be, let's say, clear that mask.
One thing to bear in mind while David's doing the mask properly this time,
yes.
One thing to bear in mind with the mask is your color editor alterations apply based on your mask. So what we mean by that is if, for example, you had a gradient mask that went from 100% to 0, 50% in the middle, the impact of your color editor will follow the impact of your mask. So if you have a mask with a soft fall off, that soft fall off will also apply to the color editor. So it will edit the colors as it starts to fade away from the mask, but it's going to have less and less and less impact as it gets to no mask area. So they're compound. You're going to have a mask which makes a selection, And then what's in that selection is 100% covered, unless you start tapering off the mask, and then you're slowly tapering off the effect.
There you go. You happy with that now?
It's better. I'd refine it personally, but no.
We could look at that, and then we could right click and say refine, which if you do have a slightly dodgy mask, you can actually
There we go.
make it a lot more, refined, funnily enough. Yeah. So there we go. But don't get too bogged down in it. If you can get away with doing a quick and dirty one, do so. If there's elements which you do want to pay a bit more attention to around here, then Magic Brush would be the way to go. Nice one. All right, over to you, I think.
Okay, so with that mask done, let's take an example. So we talked about just now the advanced color editor allowing you to choose saturated, desaturated areas and so on. But to be honest, 90% of the time, a simple mask is going to do that work for you. So here's a perfect example. We've got nice, rich, saturated light trails up here. The reason being because they're pretty much at the camera's eye level, as it were, or lens level. Down here, looking over the freeway, we don't. So I've got two options. I could, and actually it's probably we didn't try this before, David, but this might go wrong, but we're going to give it a go. So what we could do is choose a section that is less saturated. So I'm going to choose this red here, and I am going to, in the technical term, whack up the saturation. Now you can see that saturation is affected there quite well. Fine, but it's also obliterated these lights up here. So to prove the point that this is reactive to saturation, let's just pull that down, and you'll see, let's just even pull down the red it's covering, and you'll see we can control that it's not now affecting these up here, but it is still affecting those. And the reason is because these lines down the bottom had less saturation, i.e. nearer to the middle on the advanced tool. As you get further out to the outside, that's more saturation. We've excluded that from the range, so you're not going to affect the ones at the upper level.
No, and there's no way to do that in the basic tab. So
no, not at all.
Stressing yourself, getting angry at it, and then of course you can still do a layer on the basic tab.
So
but
the quick option, and it is the quick option in broad terms, is I'll even turn my mask on so we can see. And look, it doesn't really matter. I was sort of winding David up, but I can draw masks over here if we need to. It doesn't really matter because as long as, and going back to what we said earlier, as long as there's no red in there, if I were to go to the basic tab now and select red and bring that saturation up, I can also change the lightness. So we can make it brighter or darker, but I can whack that up if I want to match the saturation of the ones above, and it's only affecting the area that I've masked and over here. The gotcha, of course, is if I've got stuff that's also not just, don't think just red, anywhere in this section within my mask, it will also apply. And if you want to see that, so advanced has the option to view selected color range down here. The basic tab, whenever you pull up that wheel, you're also, oops, sorry, wrong one. Whenever you pull up that wheel, it's also going to switch the display to show you only the selected color range, so you can just verify what's included and what's not. So that's light trails, pretty easy. And actually, so if you think about it in terms of color editor, very rarely, generally speaking, are you going to be making a uniform change across a picture with the color editor. You might do it with white balance, you might do a color balance change, but color editor across a whole image, quite rare. You're normally going to be sort of combining it with some sort of layer usage.
Yeah, and I think the judgment call is, can I use the basic color editor if it's just a simple editing task? If not, then you can probably decide there and then to go straight to advanced. And then you can decide, can I accurately select my color range in a reasonable amount of time without, stressing and flapping and changing the range and getting frustrated? Or does it make more sense to do a quick layer and then the color edit like so?
Yeah.
So have that little chat with yourself in your mind. Before we move on, there was a couple of questions that I wanted to pick up.
Daniel on YouTube has pointed out that snow in Chicago is grey.
Yes. Or dirt. Yeah.
Can't help with that.
Not much we can do about that. Chris was asking, will Capture One get some form of object-subject selection like Lightroom? Yes, it will. If you're not aware, on our community forum, so it's support.captureone.com, we have a community forum, which I would strongly encourage you to sign up to, because there's all kinds of discussions about there on Capture One. Funnily enough, it's a user-to-user community, so it's not designed as a way to get support. We have a whole team of support people for that, but it's for you guys and girls to talk amongst yourself. But there is...
You heard it here second.
Yes, there is a section which is also dedicated to feature requests, and you'll see on that section that obviously object selection is pretty popular for obvious reasons, and we've already said that is coming. So yeah, you can look forward to that. There was also a question. Tom was asking, what are the steps to create a mask? We can show you quickly, Tom, but I'd also recommend if you go to, again, support.captureone.com and the live stream section, there was a two-part series on working with layers, which I'd strongly recommend watching, because there's so much you can do with layers that it really is very valid to do that, definitely.
I was going to say, we can do a very, very, very quick demo. So effectively, if you want a new layer and you want to do it purposefully, you're going to go to this little plus button here, click and hold if you want. You can have an empty one, or you can have a filled one, or a different type. But if you wanted to affect the whole image, it's filled. An empty one, you're going to tell it which bits you want to include. And from that, you're going to paint with either the brush, the magic brush, gradient tool, radiant, or radial tool. These are for a different type of layer. If you don't have any layers selected, there's actually a quicker way of doing that, which is just pick a tool and start drawing, and Capture One will start creating a layer for you already. Just bear in mind that when I click on another tool, it's going to use the same layer and could override it. But quick ways, click on the plus button or start painting.
Nice one.
So talking about painting layers, fun one. Magic Brush is a very, very, very good tool, but it has its limitations. So when I say to Magic Brush, I would like you to select every single yellow flower in this field, please, it may struggle. Now, you've got, and again, going back to what David was saying in terms of the mindset of the workflow, you've got to work out when you're trying to mask something, what separates it from other things. If its brightness separates it from other things, then maybe a Luma range is the right thing. If its shape separates it, maybe Magic Brush, maybe even Auto Mask, go old school. Yeah. But if its color separates it from everything else in the image, then that's what color editor's for. And actually, it's got a really cool, secret, not so hidden function that no one really uses, but no one really knows about. So whether I choose basic or advanced, it doesn't really matter. But I'm going to choose advanced, and I'm going to use my picker. This is an iPhone photo, so it's a raw iPhone shot, and I'm going to pick the yellow in there. Now, because I'm cynical, I'm worried that some of the green might also be selected. So I can click on my little view selected color range thing here, and yet confirmed. So while the sky has gone gray, so it's out of the range, the green of the plants isn't. So I'm going to move this in. There we go. Perfect. It now looks like a 1980s poster, which is kind of funky, yes. Or album cover or whatever you want. But more importantly, I can now verify that I've got the yellow stuff. Now, if I want it to be a little more forgiving, we can spread that smoothness and it'll get there. So let's go out to here. And if I wanted to, I can now change the hue, the saturation, and the lightness of the yellow flowers. But if I want to change something that's not the hue, the saturation, or lightness, that's no good to me, because this tool limits me to only those three things. Only it doesn't. So if I click on the three magic dots, there's a function here which is so powerful, but no one knows about it.
And very hidden, yeah.
And very hidden, yeah. So create mask layer from selection. So to the previous question about how do you create layers, this is one of the other ways of doing it. You choose a color range. In the advanced tool, you can choose how saturated or desaturated it is by changing this this arc, how smooth it is, or whatever, and then go to create a mask layer from the selection. My mask is now better than anything that any other... I'd like to see David do this manually. There will be a 3-hour long webinar
with
that he does that in.
one pixel-sized brush. Yeah.
But if I go to display grayscale mask, that's the mask it's created. And it's created it.
just stop you
Sorry,
there
yeah.
a second. Just show how you pulled that
Oh,
off
sorry.
because
Yeah. So up
because
here
that
we've
was
got
a
our.
question came up earlier. And
Okay, so
what's the benefit of this mask as well?
right. So let's just turn that off. So to turn my mask on or off is a simple one: M on the keyboard, mask on, mask off. If I want the grayscale mask, I can either, and this applies to turning it on or off, go to this little shortcut menu up here and say always or never. That's what M is doing, and the shortcut tells you. Or grayscale is Option and M or Alt and M. And if I do that, I then get to see, with all of the image removed, just the mask. And what that shows me is a more detailed. So I can't really see whether or not these green leaves are included in that, because the subtle shades of red on any color, and there's no one color that's going to work for everyone. So it's better sometimes to switch to grayscale so we can just verify that that's correct. And if I wanted to, for example, make that mask a little bit tighter, I can refine it. So it's going to bloom a little bit and it'll be a bit more forgiving, or I can just keep it where it was. But the grayscale mask is a way of almost, I guess, shutting out the image just to focus on the mask temporarily. I wouldn't do your editing like this. Bad things will happen. But we now have a mask that was created from a color range called yellow. Now you'll see that because I created a layer from the color range, my background layer has still got the yellow layer selected, but I didn't make any changes to it. So it's still got it. It's still got that segment, but there are no changes to it. Instead, I'm going to go to this layer, because now I'm not limited to only those three options. I can now go to any tool, and we can up the contrast. We can up saturation if we want to. We can change the white balance of the yellow. Kind of don't, but but even, we could change the internal clarity, so the internal contrast within the yellow areas, all by using or starting from the color editor tool to make a mask selection in order to play with it later. So you have to think in terms of workflow. Number one, am I going to affect just an area or the whole image, in which case we're talking layers? Number two, what separates what I'm trying to edit from everything else? Is it its brightness, so Luma range? Is it its shape, so Magic Brush or Auto Mask? And if it's its color, that's where Color Editor comes in.
And comment from Juan said, "I bet this would be useful for portrait mask creating." Yeah, it can
I
be.
knew you
actually.
should say that. So I'm gonna hand over to David again in a second, actually, to talk about portrait stuff. But one other final thing, which is the color editor reacts to the colors that are in your image, which means that, and we'll use this example here. I'm going to zoom in on the sun out here over the Hollywood Hills. This image has an ICC profile applied to it. So whenever you load an image into Capture One, you get to choose how that image is treated at its raw level. So in other words, before you start playing with any tools, what profile and what curve should Capture One apply to that image to begin with? And a lot of cameras now have Pro Standard, which is the latest and greatest from Capture One. The one previously was Flash. There are also different profiles. If you have a Fuji camera, for example, it's going to load in your film simulations. Is that true for Nikon as well?
There are some picture styles for Nikon. Also, if you look at Sony, there's a couple of profiles, one being Capture One colors, one being closer to Sony colors. So yeah, it varies a little bit brand to brand. Yeah.
So the key thing to take away in terms of your mindset with this is do this first. Get your ICC profile right first, because, and I'll show you now, this is the original one for my camera called Flash, and then they introduced Pro Standard. Pro Standard looks like that. Flash looks like that. Here I'm editing yellows. Here I'm editing oranges. Very big difference in terms of how the color editor is going to perform. So get your basics right before you start playing and altering colors as well.
And I definitely say, double check on that particular tool what you're actually using, because Pro Standard was a new standard that was launched. It was quite a while ago, 2 years now.
2 years ago, yeah.
Yeah. So have a look at what your camera is running with, because I'm just looking through. Yeah, I'm just going to steal.
I was going to say, and you can set it as the default. So when you've decided which one you prefer, you can then click on the little three dots and go to save as defaults for that camera. It won't apply to everything, but for that camera, it will then load it in.
So I've just, if I steal the screen, so you can see here for this shot, Sony A7 Mark IV, Pro Standard. So there's also the generic curve, which probably fairly subtle change. But I would, if you have the option, I would set that as your default. For 99% of the time, it's going to give you a better result for sure. But there are some cases which it might make sense to just pick and choose. But I'd recommend setting Pro Standard as the default.
Yeah.
Fabulous.
It's your go. Over to
It's
you.
my go. Are we looking
It's
at?
your go. We're
Are we
talking about
looking at
portraits.
skin?
We're talking
Portraits.
about skin and people.
Yep.
Which I don't do. I just delete them.
You don't have to deal with people. Yeah, exactly. And there was a question which came up from where was it? Alex might have answered it actually. Yeah, Alex did. But there was a question which we're going to look at after we've looked. Well, it actually forms part of this, but after we've looked at editing skin, the question was, what are the circumstances? So if I just pick her blazer for a second, what are the circumstances for moving this little dot around? So hold that thought, because Paul's got a trick for that. But in the advanced tool, the only reason why you might want to move the dot is if you're playing around with the color range and you can't get beyond the dot, because the dot is effectively the color that I picked. So we make an assumption that you probably don't want to exclude the color that you picked.
There is, though, from a workflow point of view, you're more likely, if it's going wrong, you're better off probably repicking than you are trying to guess where it is in that section.
Yeah, but if for some reason, I mean, her coat's quite a good example of color range in terms of saturation, because I can cut out the saturated bits, I can cut out, the lower saturated, or I can cut out the greater saturated bits. But that dot will prevent me moving the range once I get close to it. Again, the assumption being that we figure you don't want to cut out the color that you've picked. But if you're changing your mind and you think, actually, I do want to move it a bit, then I can. But for the skin tone tool, there's a practical use for it as well.
One thing I've just noticed, but we haven't told people, which we need to, is instead of that reset, do you want to show people how to delete a dot? So you can have several advanced color editor dots.
So let's say we've got a clothing pick. Actually, let's switch to a picture with more colors in it. So if I pick prawns, let's pick the flower, let's go over here and so on. So I've got 3 different color picks, which can all have their own variation of, I'm just going to mess up the sliders, don't pay attention to the horrors inflicted on the picture. But first of all, down here, you can see before and after. So this was how it looked when I picked it. This is how it looked after ruining it with the sliders. So you'll see that change for each particular one. You can also see your delta hue change, delta saturation, and delta lightness. You can also see the difference in the RGB values before and after as well.
There's just to clarify that there's a danger here that a lot of people fall into the trap of. David, could you please click on the violet flower again and choose that as a picker?
Right, exactly. So
then
you'll get
it does not go back to the original one that you wanted. These are cumulative and they are different each time. So each time you click, it's creating a new color reference, and you can accidentally end up fighting between them.
Yeah, because you
so
think,
just be really
I've
careful.
This again, and then you think you're back on one of your earlier picks, but you're fighting in between the two. So if you want to return to a particular one and obviously play around with the sliders, then just go back to it in the list. If you've made a complete hash of it, of course, you can hit on the minus down here, and then that will get rid of your color picks like so. You can have 25. So if you compare that to basic, you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and a complete range adjustment, which just kind of hard to explain, but it does shift the hue of the entire picture in one direction or another, or of course we can saturate or desaturate. But yeah, up to 25 picks compared to the 8 or 9 you see here. So again, more flexibility as well. And these 2 little icons down here are actually clickable. So you've got a shortcut here, which is expand the whole range. So if you pretty much know in your mind's eye, actually, I want to make sure I want to affect all the blues, all the greens, all the reds or whatever, then you can hit that, and then that will span the full range. If you want to be in a situation where you say, I want to adjust all of the picture except for, then you can do an exclusion. So if I hit on the sky and say invert, then it'll adjust everything except for my selected color. So that can be quite nice. If you've nailed a particular color and you want to make sure it's protected, then you can do so. So yeah, good point that we missed. All right, skin tone. So it's called skin tone because it was designed specifically for skin, but Paul's going to show you where it can be used not for skin. So ideally, this tab should be called something else, really, shouldn't it, Paul? Should be the...
It should be called refine, I think.
The refine or
yeah,
normalize
yeah.
or equalize or something like that. So the goal of this particular tab is to take a selection of colors or a color range, and anything within that range, convert it to a picked point. So the purpose of that was generally using for skin. So if we look at our model here, that's reset. So we've got, I mean, sun hitting her on this side, then it's falling into shadow. So if we look at the, the sum total of her skin tone, it's kind of not too bad here. You would expect it to be cooler, but on the bridge of our nose here, it's gone, much cooler, not as good. Quite often an issue we see, certainly if you're working in a cold environment or cold studio, when people's hands gets cold, the color flushes out of it big time. So it becomes really noticeable, especially if someone's got a hand closer to their face. Faces tend to have makeup, not ours, we've spared you that today, but they tend to forget about body parts and so on, so there can be a mismatch. So what you're doing is you're saying, hey, Capture One, make sure on the skin tone tab, this is my desired skin tone. So I'm going to choose that. So that little dot again is my picked area. This is my color range. And we've got an additional bank of sliders called uniformity. And what happens is, as I drag any of these sliders to the right, depending on its component, so hue, everything in this color range will get transformed to the picked color. So if I just go a bit berserk and open that right up and drag hue all the way to the right, did you see her lips change color? So because her lips fall within that boundary, then they get uniformed, if you like, to that pick point. So we could do the same with saturation, and we could do the same with lightness if I actually grab the slider. So now everything in this color range has been squashed or pushed towards that picked color. Now that's obviously over the top. So we wouldn't want to ruin all our modeling and lighting and so on. So now we would look to achieve something like this. However, you're going to say, but you've affected here, maybe it has some effect on her hair depending on her hair tone, maybe it picked up a hue on the clothing that she was wearing. Obviously here it's not an issue. So again, how do we deal with that? It's best to do it in a mask. So if I just reset everything that I did and make a new field adjustment layer, and you're going to say why field, because there's a few ways of using this tool. So you could do the clown mask approach where you just mask very quickly on the areas that you want to adjust, or we do it this way, which takes a little bit longer, but I think gives you a better result. So I've done a field mask, so it's going to affect everything again, but we're going to fix that afterwards. So pick my good skin tone. As I'm going to be working with a smaller mask, I'm not afraid to maybe widen this or over widen it. I'm going to pull my hue, saturation and lightness sliders across to what I think looks good. So now I can judge, all right, that's probably maybe a bit extreme because it's lost a lot of the natural lighting or anyway, but that's the maximum kind of correction I could get to. So I'm just going to rename this skin, and then I'm going to right click and say clear that mask. So that's going to get rid of the mask, but leave those adjustments. So these adjustments that I've set are going to be stuck on that layer. So if I clear that mask, grab myself a brush, and by right clicking I can get up my brush settings, and then I can decide exactly where I want to paint that correction in. Now right now I've got a very heavy flow, so that means as soon as I start brushing, it's going to brush all of that correction in one hit. You can see that happening across her face. Now that might be, again, a little bit too extreme. So if I clear that mask again, right click, bring my flow right down, which means my mask is going to build up gradually as I brush paint back and forth. So now I can be a bit more fluid with it, and areas that I want more correction I can brush more, areas that I want less correction I can brush less. So you can very nicely moderate how much skin tone correction you get in. We could probably even fix the little bit of a hairline there as well. And it also means any other areas, like this isn't too bad, but we could brush a bit there. If her hand was super red or cold or whatever, we could fix it along here as well. Don't have to worry about the jacket because it's so far away from this color range that I'm not going to affect it. So again, don't necessarily get too obsessed about how good your mask is. If we do Option M, we can see the mask like so. If we press M, we can see the mask where it actually underlies. If you've gone a bit crazy, don't forget you've got the opacity slider up the top here, which means I can choose anything from no correction to max correction. So if you want a bit of natural variation, we can just roll the opacity back a bit. But it's a super powerful tool because all of you watching are more than capable of doing that. I mean, if you put this image in front of me and said, fix that in Photoshop, I honestly wouldn't know where to start because I'm not expertly trained in Photoshop. But any of you using this
you'd be doing frequency separation and
well, exactly. Yeah, I think without stepping on the toes of experienced Photoshop people, it would be a more complex process to do so in Photoshop, or you would need to invest in some kind of plugin or whatever, which was kind of built around that. But you've also got the raw data here, which is a big plus. So as opposed to doing that on a JPEG, a TIFF file or whatever, you're dealing with raw data, which gives you a super nice correction. So it works brilliantly on skin, but a couple of things just to be aware of. Be aware that it's an additional bank of sliders. So you see you've got uniformity, does that trick of pulling everything in that color range to that pick point. You can still change the hue, saturation and lightness of your picked color, but the range of these sliders is way more gentle than the ones here. So you won't get like big sea changes. So if I look at saturation left to right, it's not making a massive change as it would in the advanced. So they are tuned to be much more subtle. You've still got your expand full color range. You can still see your selected color range. You've still got your before and after, but it's just one pick. But if you want to do this trick on, let's say you've got two faces, two different skin tones, you can just do it on another layer, and then you can do another skin tone adjustment. So if you've got a group setting with 5 people, all with varying skin tone, or you've got the one who's got perfect skin tone and doesn't need touching, you can still deal with them on an individual basis. But you can also use this for something else.
Well, you can use it for everything else.
Everything else, yeah.
So it's called Skin Tone Tool because that was how it was invented. It was what it was born out of from studios. But we use it quite extensively in landscape stuff. So if we go back to that sunset that talked about before. Before
you wail into that, I'm just going to pick up on a question from Connor.
Okay.
Is there a way to drastically change the color in my images? Yes, which you can also do it with the skin tone tool as well.
Yes,
there is
you can. But one of the answers is with layers.
Yeah.
So if for instance, if we've got this little annoying bit here, which is a lens flare, which is bright red. So I've just masked it by creating a new layer, adjustment layer 1. I can go to my color editor. I would use advanced, and I can shift the hue to be more yellow or more pink. But it doesn't go far enough. So all I'm going to do is create another layer, same mask, or I could have even copied the mask from that layer. Now choose this color and say shift the hue again, and I get to green. It obviously needs some finessing, but you get the idea. We can shift across. I think it's 30-degree increments.
30 degrees,
per layer. So yes, you can. It's a little bit fiddly, but you can. The reason it's not done so simply is to stop people making very bad mistakes, because you can go extreme with color editor and things just start to unwind. But yes, you can. So skin tone works for skin, obviously, but it also works for any place where we're trying to normalize a shade. So if we go back to the old style of Flash profile that we talked about, so Pro Standard is new, this is Flash. I don't like how yellow this is. So on the skin tone tool, I'm going to choose the color that I want most of the sky to be, or how I remember it. And I can tell it the rest of the sky, please. Can you please get, say, or similar hue? Don't worry about what's happening. Similar saturation and similar lightness. You don't want it too similar, but because obviously you're going to lose all the texture, obviously. But you can certainly bring it together. Now, the challenge is I picked wrong. What I thought, go back to the iceberg thing, what I thought was a nice orange color clearly was slightly green. So in answer to the question earlier about the dot, in the skin tone tool, this is really powerful because I can change what color I want the other parts of that sector to align with, and I can do it afterwards. So I can say, actually, I want you to be more orange like this, and actually I can then alter that color as well. We can make it more saturated, less saturated, and play, basically, if you choose to. Most of the time we're trying to get it back to what was there when we remember seeing it, but yeah, absolutely, you can use the skin tone tool to shift color completely. Now, there is a debate as to whether or not you would go to this level, because the other way of doing the massive color shift is, as David sort of alluded to, you can use the skin tone tool really dangerously to do some of that. But yes, you can move that picker around and change overall colors. So should we do a quick fire, sort of quick landscape one? Forgot a polarizer. So if you wanted the nice deep blue sky of a polarizer, or you used a polarizer on a wide lens, which means you get the weird bump of darkness in the middle because the polarizer, a circular one, doesn't see it uniformly. Well, we're going to click on, let's say, the midpoint of the sky. And I'm going to say, well, actually, I want to expand that a little bit and have a nice smooth fall off. That midpoint, I want to be a bit richer, a bit more saturated, a bit deeper. And the rest of the sky, please match it. So now I've got non-polarized sky, polarized sky. Not quite. It's a bit of a hack, but you can see we can use the color editor, especially the advanced one and the skin tone one, to even out colors just as much as we can change them. And that's exactly what the skin tone tool was there to do. Grass. So if we have grass that's not particularly even, well, same deal. So we're going to pick a midpoint of that grass. And we're going to say, actually, and if we want to, again, view selected color range, I can see what's included. Bear in mind the tree is. So interesting one there. I can then say, saturate, please. Saturate the color that I chose. So this is what I'm doing to the color I chose, and darken it a little bit. And with all the other colors that are in this section, please make the hue the same. Please make the saturation the same. Be careful with lightness. I alluded to it on sunset, but if you do this, you're losing contrast, because the lightness is making everything go into that same brightness, or roughly the same brightness as the color you chose. So you're going to lose that depth. But if you think this is a subtle change, if I just temporarily undo it, there's before, there's after. It's quite a deep green. Now, I've accidentally included the tree. Maybe I didn't want to. Right-click on background, move background adjustments to a new layer. Fancy.
Fancy, yep. That was added.
And now, that was added
16.1.
last, last mini release, as it were. Now, I've got a whole mask over that layer, but I can choose with my eraser to get rid of said tree. Very roughly, we call it a David mask. But now I've got change grass, not change tree, and we can do that again and again. But it's the skin tone tool that we're using to do that. For landscape, I mean, there's loads of other stuff with landscape, but I think that's sort of it, I think, for the color editor. We can, one thing to bear in mind, we'll cover it very, very quickly, very, very quickly. Black and white tool. A lot of you use the black and white tool to do conversions. Bear in mind that these sliders react to the underlying color. So I've increased yellow and decreased red. If I were to go into our color editor, remember this is still a color image, and choose the color of Ayers Rock or Uluru, and then say we're going to desaturate it or increase its saturation, because I've increased the saturation. Told you, with great power, great responsibility. But more importantly, if I change its hue, what's happening is, because I'm changing it to be more red or more yellow or whatever in between, these sliders here are reacting to the underlying color that I've delivered. So be careful when it comes to using the black and white conversion tool if you've altered things with color editor, but more importantly, use the color editor with the black and white conversion tool to really bring out detail and stuff when you do a conversion.
Mm-hmm. And also be mindful if you're cranking RGB curves, they're also going to change the saturation. So that might also, affect how your black and white contrast looks as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. We've got a few questions to run through. So Prasad said the same thing. Yeah, in the skin tone tab, you can expand the selection range to full circle. Then you can move the little dot around to change the hue. You can do that. Sometimes it has unwanted effects on other parts of the image, so it might be better to do that on the layer, but that does work. Yes, Corey, through the magic of the internet, we are actually in the same country, me and Paul, but we're not in the same location. So I'm running Capture One on my side of the UK, and Paul's running on his, so we can very quickly switch between two things. So actually, I've got my camera mirrored on that scene and not on this scene, so that's a bad continuity there. Other questions, Alex? No, sorry, it was Irene, I think. Possibly Irene. Sorry, Irene, if I forgot your name. Can you repeat how to pick multiple colors with the basic editor? Yes. So you can't do it by clicking. It has to be with the direct color editor option. So if I grab my picker and click on the whatever they are, loop-in accessory, then wherever I click, Capture One is only going to pick one color patch, whatever that may be. But if so, it happens that the color spans a couple of those set ranges that you saw in the basic ranges here, then it will attempt to adjust more than one at the same time. But that's by using the direct color editor. So first of all, steps to reproduce is you need to grab the picker, you need to click and hold on the color that you want to edit, and then you'll see four little arrows popped up then and disappears, which tells me to move my mouse pen up, down, left, right. So now if I go to the left, you see that's controlling the hue, and it's actually picked those two color swatches. So if I do some big
so just to be clear though, so Capture One chooses the swatches that it believes you mean. You can't control.
You can't control that. Exactly. Now if I go up, that will boost the saturation. If I go down, that will take it out. If I hold my Option key on the keyboard, click, and drag left, that's going to change the lightness. But yes, as Paul says, Capture One will pick, okay, David has picked here, this contains components of that and that, so which will be these two, like so. So if we go to our color editor, let's reset that, the advanced, and click in exactly the same place, and out of interest, turn on view selected color range. If I go probably this way or down this way, then you can see if we really squeeze that up, whoops, then I do miss a little bit of it. So it's subtle, but just probably down here is probably the easiest spot. If I pull that in and pull the smoothness right down, you can see we actually cut a little bit out. But by introducing a wider range, we now make sure we have included everything, like so. So Capture One will make that decision for you in the basic tab, but in the advanced tab, you can pretty much, certainly in this situation where we're never gonna hit anything close to the tones of the loop-ins. So if you want everything except the loop-ins, you could pretty much be rest assured to go click and then whack, whack, like so, and then you've got everything. Or you could do the opposite. You could pick the loop-ins like so, expand the full range, hit invert, and then everything is kind of protected like so. So yeah, that's how you do that. There was another question. Also this, what do the brackets on the right and the left of the color wheel stand for and how they can be used? Oh, you're probably talking about, I'm going to probably embarrass myself and say I don't know in a second. Oh, you're talking about these guys. So this one will move the dot up and down.
Well, that's saturation. The other one is lightness.
So this is moving that around, and then this guy here, I can't remember the technical explanation.
Is it luminosity again?
I think it's
value or something.
I think it's, do you want to have the entire luminosity range, or do you want to restrict it? But normally the effect is so incredibly subtle that you can't actually see much. So I haven't fallen into a situation where I felt the need to adjust that. So this one keeps it on the same color pick, but allows you to, obviously if I've picked a skin tone and I want to uniform it and make everything a bit more saturated, then I can do that kind of thing. But again, I haven't really felt the need to use it a great deal. So focus on what happens with your uniformity sliders, selecting the color range. You'll see here, if I pull this down, you can see, the subtle effect it would have, but only in effect once you've pulled any of these sliders over to the right. Cool, let's reset that absolute mess. Was there one more question? Selection. I think that was that. In the chat, remember people, put your questions in the Q&A tab so we can see them.
I think we're good.
Alex has answered those.
Yep.
Daniel was asking, why do I start with a fill mask on the skin tone adjustment? So essentially so I can see what I'm doing, because if we make a new mask and I pick my desired skin tone and I start playing with the sliders, I can't actually see what it's doing. So by starting with a complete field adjustment mask, let's zoom in a bit so we can see, I can first of all pick the skin tone, adjust my range, play around with the sliders to see what it's doing.
So just for Daniel's benefit, bear in mind the deleting the mask and then re-adding it. That's one way. You could equally just delete the bits you don't want after you've done that.
Yeah, exactly. So what I could do is, let's say, okay, I prefer this look now, so I could grab my eraser and then I could go ahead and delete the stuff. Let's just bump that up. Then I could delete the stuff that I didn't want. I just tend to find that a little bit slower than brushing in where I do want it.
But it's effectively, it's just a method of masking. It's nothing really to do with the color editor. This is just a masking workflow of how you choose to apply your edits.
I could clear that, and then I could use, like if I felt I could pick it with the magic brush as an example, I could do that. So if I felt that would be the easiest way to pick the skin tone of a whole, which actually doesn't work too bad, then I could do it that way. So there's the way you make the mask is entirely up to you, but I happen to think the nicest way to do it is to grab your brush on something nice and soft with a low flow, so you can kind of dab it in where you feel it will have the most benefit. And of course with a low flow, if you want it more active in one spot, you can brush more. If you want it less active in another spot, you can brush less. So it gives you that additional flexibility. So I hope that makes sense. Where can we re-watch this? It's on YouTube. So if you go to Captron's YouTube channel, we're actually broadcasting right to YouTube at the same minute. So it's straight to YouTube as soon as we've finished. All right. Alex, thank you in the background for answering a billion questions as well. But I would say for faces, don't again get too bogged down with, okay, it's got to cut perfectly around here and perfectly there. Generally, masking works better if it's a little bit softer and a little bit more fluid. If everything has like super hard edges, it gets very, very noticeable that you've made a mask. So
it's also the reason that the skin tone tool is limited in its scope of what it can normally change, so that you don't see a fall off from where you've used it to where you haven't. Otherwise, it'd look really jarring if you've got smooth color to this point and then all of a sudden it drops off immediately. It's designed to blend.
Yeah, exactly. Because there's nothing worse than seeing something that looks, well, obviously
the wrong neck is the word you're looking for,
and obviously edited. Yeah. Oh, geez, we're out of time, but we've got one thing to talk about. So
one more thing.
Shall I switch back to you then? Pew. Oh, I thought you were doing a swift change in the background.
A swift change?
Yeah,
Well, I can't do a swift change if I'm on the screen.
you're not
I
on the
mean,
screen.
right, fine. Hello. So this is
Smooth.
a story about what happens when you ask AI to come up with a movie poster. It maybe
Exactly.
misinterprets your intention. However, um,
Which is
from
why AI is bad, except in
yeah,
Capture One.
look at
Yeah,
that. It's a Grover
it's
as a
uncanny, isn't it?
cowboy
It's
where he hasn't
uncanny.
even been. It's incredible.
But yes.
We are heading out to, or in part, Chicago. So we're going to do some rooftop shooting and stuff. We are then going to head across to the mountains over in Wyoming and bits in between.
And this is happening next week, by the
This is
way.
happening from next week, and we are going to cover things like cityscape shooting in quite a lot of detail, landscape shooting, sunrises and sunsets, aerial shooting, weather permitting. We're going to cover some of that. We will also be covering things like the practical parts of photography. So we've got our special guest, Brian, who works within Yellowstone, who we will cover some of the bits that people probably don't think about, and actually hopefully some people do. But over the following week after we've landed, we need a little bit of time to sort stuff out.
Yes.
We're going to be presenting 3 different live streams from there, and then probably catching up as well when we get back with some other stuff later on.
Yeah, and up on the screen now is 3 live streams that we're going to do from on the road. So the first one is a couple of days after we've got there, so we will have shot Chicago by then. So that'll be a bit of cityscape editing and potentially a bit from a bit from Salt Lake
Bonneville,
City.
Bonneville.
Bonneville.
Salt Lake City and Salt Flats.
Yeah, Salt Flats. And then a couple of days later, we're going to be joined by a associate of Paul, who runs a gallery service over here in the UK, of which you supply images to.
Yep.
And we're going to be using Capture On Live and a bit of augmented reality, which should be exciting to see how imagery looks in any given situation. Because, of course, if someone like Paul is shooting for a client, quite often the client wants to see how this enormous enlargement is going to look in the middle of a cruise ship or in a hotel lobby or something like that. So that's something
we're going to do some audience interaction on that thing, and it's probably going to go wrong, so definitely worth watching.
You should definitely show up for that. And then finally, as Paul mentioned, we're meeting up with a lovely guy called Brian Creek. If you have a stereotypical image in your mind of what a Yellowstone ranger / environmentalist would look like, Brian is it. So please join that because you won't be disappointed. Those QR codes you can see on the left hand side. If you wave your phone at them and scan them, they will take you to the place where you can watch. Now these are only going to be on YouTube just purely for logistical reasons. Out in the field it gets a bit harder to manage multi-streaming to several locations, but I have put a handy little add to calendar link in those. Hang on, I will bring up my screen in a second to show you.
Why are you down there now?
Why am I down there? Yeah. Again, bad continuity on my part. So each of those QR codes, if I just bring my screen back, will bring you to this page. So if you want to join us next week, July 13th, there is a handy little add to calendar link. And also, if you click here, that will take you to the YouTube stream where it's going to be on. And you can also say notify me here as well. But do put it in add to calendar, because that way you're not going to miss it. And I'm sure you wouldn't want to miss out. But those codes, as I say, will take you straight to those different pages, or go to support.captureone.com and go to the live stream section.
I've just seen one comment Alan's just made saying that some of the bits that we went through quite quickly in terms of the tool, some of it in part is to demonstrate a lot of stuff in a very short period of time, and that's the reason that it's recorded, so that you can absolutely go back, watch it again, and hopefully pick stuff up. If you don't, then send in a note into the support guys if you need help. They're there to help.
Yeah. And yeah, hopefully it serves as inspiration, like to cover the entire color editor in depth from A to B. We would probably spend, I don't know, 3 hours, I guess, if you wanted to dig into every single facet. And I personally don't have the attention span to sit and listen to as fabulously interesting as both of us are, it's still a big ask to sit and listen for that long. So I hope that you draw some inspiration in terms of, okay, cool, that could be interesting. I wonder if I could apply that to my work. Then of course, you know, the other option is to head back to support.capture1.com. If you go to Capture One, here's the community I mentioned, this little link up here, so please join that. But we've got a whole user guide, FAQ. The community is a great place to ask other people for help and advice as well. Everyone is generally very friendly and nice on there, so that's another place you can seek to do that. And Juan says, that's how I got to this class. I love the YouTube reminders. Yeah, it's well worth subscribing. It's good for my for my personal goals and everything as well, to get YouTube subscribers. But you know, on a practical note, it does mean that you don't miss stuff. So
you're 2 words off of like and share.
Like and share, smash the like, etc. Oh, there was one question from Connor which I missed, and he was asked about, could I create a preset where I can drastically change the greens to white?
You can.
You could do. I mean, it would be a case of capture one over here. Press this button. It would be a case of, let's say you've picked your whatever color you want to drastically change, and I've pulled the saturation down. For example, I'm on a layer, so that's not going to work. So let's do that again. So let's say I've done this, I've drastically desaturated blues. I would then say save custom preset. And that preset will always be available up here in the color editor, and it will also always be available in the styles and presets under custom presets. But just be aware, trying to make like a brown shoe white is not necessarily always foolproof, or a red shoe look white, because just desaturation doesn't necessarily do it. So we often get this request for e-commerce quite a bit, and sometimes it requires a little bit more fiddling and skill to make it look realistic.
There's also another thing to bear in mind, which is if that only works as a preset if you can guarantee to yourself that red in one image is going to be red in the next, because white balance changes, color tones change, the color of light changes, everything can change between one shot and the next. So your preset, if it's going to be restrictive, you're going to struggle to keep uniformity.
Yeah. And last comment from Seb, it'd be great if you can do a color grade masterclass on how to match color from a palette. We are going to do that in September, October, somewhere around there. So yes, that's exactly what we're going to do. Doing a color grading Capture One to a specific mood board / color palette. So look out for that. Awesome. All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining us today. Sorry for running over time a little bit. We actually said before starting we're going to struggle to fill an hour with this, but as usual, that's not the case. And please come back and join us on July the 13th as well. I'd love to see you joining in on YouTube. So thanks again, Paul, for joining us.
I'm off to pack.
Off to pack, yes, exactly. I did sweep all the mess out, which is now carefully hidden to one side, but there's a large backpack behind me full of stuff. So, and I must get me a hat as well. Cheers, everyone. Take care. Bye now.